Predict, pick, and prevail in your fantasy football leagues with Nick Giacobbe and Nick Cap. From breakouts to busts, superstars to sleepers, these are the guys that will help you achieve fantasy glory. This is the PrimeTime Fantasy Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to Season 4, Episode 28 of the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast, where we give you our predictions, our picks, with the hopes that we help you prevail throughout Week 7 and the rest of the 2024 fantasy football season. I'm your host, Nick Giacobbe. Joining me is Nick Cap. Nick, Week 7, that's scary to say in the fantasy football world, as we are just about halfway through with your fantasy football season. Most playoffs are weeks 15, 16, 17. So once you get through Week 7, you kind of can look at your record and say, what do I have to do to make a push, or what do I have to do to hold a lead? Last year in our league, I think I was 6-1 after Week 7, and I missed the playoffs. So you're not out of it yet, but you definitely need to explore some trade options. Make sure you hit that waiver wire, which we're going to talk about first thing up in the show. But Week 7, Nick, and that's a little bit scary for some of us.
Yeah, dude, the season's kind of flown by, and this is a big part. This is where you got to pivot. It's a big waiver portion of the season, like you mentioned. I know Nick and I have a ton of guys to go through this week, crazy compared to other weeks. And then, of course, the trades. I mean, I've been trying to wheel and deal this whole past week, yesterday, of course. So it's a big time. It's a very important part of your fantasy season. Nick and I, unfortunately, we don't really talk too much about trade candidates, but we always talk about guys we like rest of the season and things like that. So if you do have trade options, I'm going to make a quick plug for the Sunday live show to come and drop them. But, Nick and I are really going to hone in on the waivers. We got a ton of guys. We got 5 quarterbacks, 8 running backs, 4 receivers, 3 tight ends, and 5 defenses. That is a ton of fantasy football knowledge we're going to spill on you today.
And I get frustrated with trades because nobody will talk trade with me. I will attempt to trade in most of my leagues, and it is a struggle and a back and forth. At least in my personal leagues to do a trade. In my dynasty league last week, I had a deal lined up, Kelsey for a 3rd round pick. I was looking to snipe that one. I would be receiving Kelsey, and he backed out of the deal later on the day. And I said, I'm not giving up more for a 1-year rental or so for Travis Kelsey. It's unfortunate because that guy who had made that trade had just traded Derrick Henry for a 2nd round pick a couple of weeks ago, and I wish I had jumped on that one. It would have been huge for my dynasty league. So unfortunately, that one fell through. And then I was talking to another guy about a couple running back options to trade one of my receivers. I was trying to get rid of Debo or a pick or something, and he was offering me up Joe Mixon. And as much as I like Joe Mixon this year, I wasn't willing to sacrifice Debo's next 3 or 4 years for 1 or maybe 2 years of Joe Mixon. So unfortunately, I did not pull the trigger on that one. My dynasty league is kind of wonky. There's definitely been some like lopsided bad trades made where I'd say to myself, how is this guy available? A couple of years ago, Kenneth Walker was traded maybe a year or two ago, and I said to myself, how is he even available? I didn't even know. So unfortunately, I haven't made a trade yet this season. I don't trade often, if I'm being particularly honest, because my leagues are pretty stingy. So that's my trade update. Nick seems to have a bit more luck in his leagues with trades, that's for sure. But we do happily answer your trade questions on the Sunday morning live shows. Thank you for those that joined us this past Sunday morning at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, right before the Bears and the Jaguars game. We told you guys, play your Bears, don't play your Jaguars. If you listen to our advice, probably worked out for you because the Bears absolutely crushed the Jaguars. So Sunday mornings, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram, every single week during the NFL season, we got you covered to answer all of your fantasy football questions. This week, again, 8:30 a.m. Eastern time, right before the Jags and I think the Patriots. It's the last London game of the season, so I think that's going to be the last show that actually we have to kind of rush to get your questions in if you do have any before that game. If you're a first-time viewer/listener of this show, maybe you came from the Sunday morning live and now you're watching one of our weekly shows, thank you so much. This is our Tuesday show. We're going to have 2 segments for you. Kick things off with the waiver wire, a full deep dive into the waiver wire to help you guys get set up for Week 7 and the rest of your season. And then we're going to do a top 5 takeaways from the week from a fantasy football perspective. Nick has 5 takeaways. I have 5 takeaways, 10 different takeaways from Week 7 for the fantasy football season. We are the PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast. You can find us on all audio streaming platforms, plus YouTube and all social media channels. So let's go to the waiver wire for Week 7, technically. And yeah, we're going to talk about it. So like Nick stated, we have a lot of players here. Start off with the quarterbacks. We have 5 of them. So Jared Goff owned in 46% of leagues. I doubt he is even available in your leagues, but if he is, he should obviously be the number 1 target. They have Justin Herbert owned in 35% of leagues. Tua Tagovailoa owned in 26% of leagues. There's an update on his condition this morning. Then 2 rookies, Bo Nix owned in 10% of leagues and Drake May owned in 4% of leagues. I'm surprised that Drake May's number is even that high. Both of those quarterbacks this week, I believe, were in the top 10 or top 11. I'm going to pull it up right now. Fantasy Bros. Yep. Drake May was quarterback 8. I'm sorry. Drake May was quarterback 9 and Bo Nix was quarterback 8. They were both ahead of Jaden Daniels and Lamar Jackson, quarterbacks 1 and 2 in the season. So, Nick, with that said, who are your top quarterback targets for this week that could really help you for the rest of the season? Because in week 7, you're not really looking for a week 7 player. You're looking for rest of the season at this point.
I really like Jared Goff. He's on a lot of waiver wires because he was on bye last week. So we definitely get a little bit of a rub there. And the Lions offense has been crazy. I'm going to talk about them a little bit later in the show, but they look really, really good as they
I don't mean to cut you off. Goff is only the quarterback 19 on the season at the moment. His average is actually pretty good. His average is 18, which is higher in the averages. But like Nick said, he did have the bye week. So people may have given up on him maybe a little bit too early. He did throw up like 2 stinkers in the first 2 weeks, but right before the bye, 26 points, and after the bye, 25. So Nick is correct that if for some reason Goff is available in your leagues and you would like or need a backup, he's the guy to go for.
For sure. And then if you're looking for the 1 week, it's kind of crazy. I like Drake May. I like going up against that Jacksonville defense. They've looked horrible. I like the 1 week start over there. The offense was flowing, 3 touchdowns in his first start of the season. So I'm a big fan of that. And then if Jared Goff is not on your waiver wire and you do need the long-term hold, I do like Tua, only 26% of leagues. And that offense has looked atrocious without him. We saw last year it was a top 3 offense for football and for fantasy football. They did not go that far off of the cliff. Their team has too much continuity to be that much worse. So I expect when Tua gets back in there, we're looking at, again, maybe not top 5 offense anymore, but they should be a top half of the league offense with that much talent. So I think Tua is a solid target, and he is available in a ton of leagues at the moment.
The crazy thing about Tua is people knocked his contract due to his injury history and stuff like that, which you can, but we're now seeing Tua's true value with the Dolphins. They're an unwatchable football team without Tua Tagovailoa.
Yeah.
Going up to the running backs here, we have a lot of running backs. I'll give you a minute to kind of list them all off based on percentages. So right now, Giants rookie running back Tyrone Tracy is owned in 46% of leagues. I truly believe he should be rostered at 100%. So go get him if you can. Probably isn't available in your competitive leagues. Tank Bigsby is owned in 44% of leagues. Travis Etienne has a hammy injury. He's going to be out for a couple weeks, and those things linger. Ty Chandler backup for the Vikings, owned in 33% of leagues. Alexander Madison for the Raiders, who seems to be the running back 1 at the moment, is owned in 35% of leagues. Then we have some lower ones with some injury replacements. So we have Isaiah Gerendo, backup for the 49ers, owned in 1% of leagues, with Jordan Mason a little bit banged up. Dante Foreman, backup for the Browns. Jerome Ford, a little bit banged up as well. He has a hamstring. He'll be out for a couple weeks. Owned in 3% of leagues. Kamani Vidal, owned in 3% of leagues. He's a guy I gave you on the Sunday morning show to go pick him up. He had a touchdown. J.K. Dobbins still looks really good, so don't think Vidal's going to be taking over for him. Maybe an interesting dynasty pickup. And then Sean Tucker for the Bucks, owned in 1% of leagues. Bucky Irving did not get 100% of the snap share with Rachaad White out. I think White will play this week, but I'm not 100% sure. But Nick, why don't you give me your top 3 running backs that you would like off this list for long-term for this season only?
So if I'm looking at it through that lens, I mean, Tyrone Tracy will be rostered and should be rostered in 80% of leagues after this week. He's been electric in his first 2 games since Singletary's been injured. There is no reason as a rookie running back he should not take over that backfield. That interior offensive line has looked really good. They got some good tackles for the Giants. So that is a very good situation for him to continue to be efficient behind that offensive line. Obviously, when Neighbors is there, he will command much more of a threat from the secondary. So you can expect Tracy not to see as many 8 in the box and could be even better than he's been. If I'm taking a fab dump, this is the guy that you want. I think he's been the best available, that has the highest upside rest of season of any running back so far that we've seen on the waivers, outside of Jordan Mason. But obviously that was a special situation before you had to spend your fab.
Yeah, thanks, Kyle Shanahan. Really great special situation. I don't even have McCaffrey, and I'm salty about it, which is hilarious.
The other guys that I like, Nick mentioned him on Sunday's show, Kamani Vidal. J.K. Dobbins is a solid running back. He's not great. He looked pretty good this past week, but I do like the upside of rookies. We know that Jim Harbaugh is always going to pound the rock and run the ball. He's going to try to manage the clock, and that is a good situation and a good offensive line and a good coaching system for any rookie running back. And the third, kind of a wild card, although he was the RB1 on the week as of this point, Sean Tucker. The Buccaneers offense looked way better without Rachaad White in there. He was one of the least efficient running backs in the NFL over the last 2 years. He was great for fantasy last year. He finished inside the top 10. And Sean Tucker finishes as the RB1. Bucky Irving rostered in a ton of leagues now. Both of them finished. I believe Bucky finished inside the top 10 or just outside. So I like that situation over there for Tampa Bay. And I don't think you need to spend nearly as much fab on Tucker.
Bucky Irving was running back 10 at 16.5 this week.
There you go.
I'll also mention this one thing. If you are the Jordan Mason owner, just go get Gerendo. Just make sure that you keep that 49ers running back, especially if you're a McCaffrey owner as well. Just don't keep your foot on the gas with the 49ers back.
Yeah.
For receivers, Romeo Doubs owned in 30% of leagues. He's a guy that I gave you on our, we do a deep dive waiver segment on our Friday show. We tell you a guy that you should go and pick up before the weekend. I gave you Romeo Doubs a couple weeks ago. He had a good game with that crazy, unpredictable Packers offense. And Gabe Davis owned in 26% of leagues. Demario Douglas owned in 21%. That was Nick's guy last week on the deep dive waiver segment. He told you to go pick up Demario Douglas before the waiver wire. I'm sure he's going to be a top 5 pickup this week. And then Juju Smith-Schuster on the Chiefs is owned in 18% of leagues. Nick, is Douglas your guy for the rest of the season at this point, or is there another one of these guys that you like more?
It's definitely going to be Douglas. I did mention him on Friday, like Nick mentioned. The thing I liked about him was he had a guaranteed timeshare in this offense before Drake May was there. He had 2 of the prior 3 games with 9 targets. He just got 9 targets this week, gets 6 catches, ton of yards, and a touchdown. Puts him very close to the top 10 this week. He might have cracked it. I don't remember. But that is great.
He was in the top 10. He was like 6, I think, or something like that.
Which is great. And listen, we do not expect Drake May to throw 3 touchdowns per game, but what we do expect is the game script to look very similar to this. It's exactly why I really liked him. When you take your shots on those later guys in your fantasy drafts, that's exactly what you're looking for. You're looking for upside, opportunity, game script on these bad offenses. Douglas, still a super young receiver in this league, now with a rookie quarterback, the best quarterback he's had in his career. I think it's a very good situation and very high upside for him. The other guy I really like, Romeo Doubs. This is the 3rd time this season, and Doubs has been out there with Jordan Love. In Jordan Love's 4 games that he's played, Romeo Doubs has led the team in snaps on every single one of those games that he's played. So he is the wide receiver with the most time on the field for the Green Bay Packers, and the Packers offense has been legit. So I like Doubs. I don't know if you could trust him as weekly, but I think Demario Douglas, you're going to want to start him next week against Jacksonville. And if he looks good there, he's pretty much locked and loaded for a lot of the rest of the season.
All right, going to tight ends here. Another Patriot, Hunter Henry, owned in 18% of leagues. Kate Otten on that Bucs offense, owned in 24% of leagues. Then Noah Fant, owned in 6% of leagues. I wouldn't roster a Seahawks tight end. That's all I'm saying. But the other guys, if you really need a tight end play, I think they're okay. Henry against the Jaguars might end up on one of our old boobs this week because the Jaguars, we're going to pick on the Jaguars a lot going forward.
I could imagine that. And then the other one that we did talk, that Nick did mention earlier, Cade Otton, he has the highest snap share of any tight end in football this season. So he is getting the reps on the field. It is exactly what you want from your tight end position. He's getting workload. They put up a ton of points. It checks the boxes in the formula for fantasy football tight ends.
All right, and some defenses to stream for week 6. I'll be honest with you, Nick. I picked up the Jags defense 2 weeks ago to stream them, and I'm going to drop them immediately for one of these guys. Chargers at the Cardinals owned in 38% of leagues. The Saints at the Broncos owned in 48% of leagues. That is a revenge game for Sean Payton, though.
Yep.
Bills at the Titans owned in 36% of leagues. Colts at the Dolphins owned in 27% of leagues. And then the Patriots in London against the Jags owned in 6% of leagues. So the defenses here, the Chargers, Colts, Saints, Patriots, and Bills. Who's your favorite one, Nick, if you could find one? I like the Bills because I think Will Levis is the worst starting quarterback in the league. And I just don't think it's even comparable. I don't know if you're talking about Will Levis at all in the next segment, Nick. So if you are, just no.
Nope.
Calvin Ridley had 8 targets. 2 of them were catchable, according to Next Gen Stats. Also, according to Next Gen Stats, he had the most possible air yards left on the table. Yeah, the Titans are really, really, really bad. They should really go call up the Steelers about Russell Wilson because Russell Wilson's not going to play for the Steelers.
I think the same thing.
The Titans or the Giants, who I'll talk about the Giants in the next 5 minutes. Both of those teams, I don't want to use the word quarterback away, but they were a quarterback away for competing in their divisions at least. I see no reason why they shouldn't go call up Russell Wilson and then draft a quarterback next year and start Russell Wilson next year. And then you have a rookie playing behind Russell Wilson. That's what I would do. I'm not a GM. Maybe the Steelers aren't shopping Russ. Maybe the contract's too high. I don't know. But I can't believe that they're still running out Will Levis out there because he is hindering that entire team, that entire offense. Call up the Colts about Flacco. I guess I'm sure they wouldn't trade him, or maybe the Browns about Jameis. I promise there is a backup out there better than Will Levis.
100%. I agree with that. And Levis is definitely a problem. It's why I do like the Bills as my number 1 option this week for sure. I know people might be concerned. Short week, they're not great against the run. The first early games in the season, they just beat up on bad teams. It's what they do. They struggle against good teams. And you guys have seen it already. Maybe we see that they struggled this week against the Jets. Maybe we see they look really good against the Jets. It's not going to change my decision. If the Bills defense is available, I'm going to go check across my leagues now, right after we record this, because they are still a waiver wire ad. I am going to add them because I do think that they are the top option for this week. If the Bills are not available in your league, I do like taking advantage of the Colts-Dolphins matchup. We know Anthony Richardson is in that game. The Dolphins have been one of the better teams against the wide receiver position, mostly because they've been bad against the run. But that does favor the Dolphins defense a little bit. And then on the Colts side, the Dolphins will not be with Tua this week for sure because he's still on the IR. He's eligible to return next week. So that is definitely a good pivot option for you.
I'm looking at the schedule for next week. We are getting forced to watch the Jets Steelers in a 13-10 game on Sunday Night Football, while the Chiefs and the 49ers are going to play at 4:00.
Yep.
Thanks, NFL. All right, that is our waiver wire segment. If you ever have waiver wire questions, feel free to shoot us a tweet or Instagram or anything like that. We could always help with that. But going to kick it to our top 5 takeaways from week 7. These takeaways are not in order. They're just 5 fantasy football takeaways that we do have with a little bit of football knowledge sprinkled in there. So, Nick, what is the first takeaway that you would like to talk about?
So I decided last week I had a theme, and I said, you know what? I kind of like that idea. So I'm going to go with the theme for this week. Not as robust as last week. Last week we talked about some of our pre-draft conceptions and kind of rest of the season and why some things make sense. We talked about 0 running back and why it actually worked out for a lot of teams. This week, we're just going to talk about some important offenses for the rest of the season. I think that's a solid theme and makes a lot of sense for fantasy football. And the first team we're going to talk about, their offense, I mentioned them earlier, the Detroit Lions. This team is diabolical under Dan Campbell. This is ridiculous. Did you see how many times they tried to throw the ball or give the ball to the offensive lineman? A ton.
Did you see what they were doing up 20 points? He was stomping on their necks and just rubbing their face in the dirt.
Yeah, and it was mean. It was not nice. It was Jerry Jones's 82nd birthday, and is the largest time that the Cowboys have lost at home, the largest margin of victory. It is absolutely horrendous. It's terrible, and they all did it because last year they told the referee this offensive line is eligible. They did not hear him. The offensive line catches the touchdown. They call it back. And that's why the Lions lost last year. So Dan Campbell said, screw you. I'm going to go stomp on your head. But let's talk some fantasy football. Jared Goff, who we mentioned on the waiver wire show or waiver wire segment earlier in the show. Jared Goff currently QB4 on the week, back-to-back performances with over 600 total yards, five touchdowns in both those games. Monty, 5 straight games over 15, worst finish so far on the year, RB20. He was drafted outside the RB20. Jahmyr Gibbs, lowest finish at the moment on the season this week, RB20, floor of 12 points per game, hasn't cracked under the bottom 20. We'll see if it happens with James Cook or Breece Hall tonight. It's definitely possible, but he's been really solid, has scored over 12 in all of his games. Amon-Ra looks great. Jameson Williams catches another long touchdown. Sam Laporta, one catch, but 52-yard touchdown. That'll do it for you. Even the kicker put up 19 points in this game. I mean, like, this was just embarrassing for the Cowboys. But here's the thing that we do need to notice. Everybody loves the Detroit Lions. I love the Detroit Lions. They are a fun team to root for. They are a fun team to watch. But this is not sustainable for fantasy. They are not going to put up 40 points in back-to-back games against weaker defenses. It's not going to happen. And their schedule gets tougher. Yes, we get these division shootouts, which are always going to be fun with this division. That I think I saw a stat where the NFC North, all four of those teams have the largest margin from points scored to points against on the season. That's 1 through 4, which is kind of crazy considering that the Chicago Bears have never been in that category, I feel like, in our entire lives. But regardless, you look at Laporta, 1 catch, Jameson Williams, 3 catches, both of them find the end zone. If they don't find the end zone, that's a bad week and a monstrous week for this team. Here's what their playoff schedule looks like for fantasy. They host the Buffalo Bills, then they go at Chicago, who's been a top defense, and at the 49ers, who have been a top defense. I'm just saying, I'm not buying this high streak. I would want to move some of these guys. They've all been sustainable, and a lot of people really like them for fantasy. The problem is you just don't know when one of them is going to hit the bad week, and it's bound to happen. They can't sustain 40 points per game. Never been done in the history of football. We'll see if they can, but at some point it's going to hurt, and I think it's going to hurt later in the year when you think you have a lock to make a championship run.
Let me talk about an offense that just faced the Detroit Lions. It looked really bad, and it's consistently kind of looked bad. The Dallas Cowboys offense is bad, not just for the NFL, but also for fantasy football this year. So this year, the Cowboys entered this year. So 2023, they were a top 2 team in offense, both with points per game and yards per game last year in the NFL. They were one of the best offenses for fantasy football. Dak was a top 10 quarterback. CD was, the number 1 receiver. They've dipped this year significantly. Through 6 weeks, they were 18th in points scored and 14th in yards per game. Dak Prescott sitting at the quarterback 11. Only has 3 games over 15 points. His average is 16.1, sitting at the quarterback 17. Rico Dowdle is sitting at the running back 28. He has 3 games under 10 fantasy points and only 1 game over 15. His average is only 11. He's barely a flex play, sitting at the running back 33. Ezekiel Elliott hasn't been any better. The Cowboys' run game has taken a significant drop-off since Tony Pollard last year. CeeDee Lamb is sitting at the wide receiver 8, and you might think that's good, but you draft him as your wide receiver 1 over a slew of other receivers and running backs. So that's honestly a bust. He has 3 games over 15 fantasy points, the other 3 not. His average is 15.4, and his average is only the wide receiver 16. That is not what you were drafting at the number 1 or number 2 overall pick. Jake Ferguson's the tight end 10. He's been okay. 3 games over 10 fantasy points out of 5. So that's pretty solid, actually. His average is 9.8. He is the tight end 8 on the season in terms of average alone. My point being, the Cowboys offense is severely underperforming, and I think Mike McCarthy has to be on the hot seat. I think a couple coaches really should be fired midseason, especially when there's head coaches like Bill Belichick and maybe even Pete Carroll just hanging out in the rafters. Mike Vrabel. I think there's very solid candidates that could come in and really take over any of these teams. Zach Taylor with the Cincinnati Bengals, Mike McCarthy with the Dallas Cowboys,
Sirianni, Doug Peterson,
Nick Sirianni, Doug Peterson. And these teams are talented. I'm talking about really talented teams that are just severely, severely underperforming. And the Cowboys are one of them.
Yeah.
Your second take.
I mentioned him because the team was staring at me. Doug Peterson, the Jaguars offense. I think that they're going to have a lot more value than we gave him credit for, and have been giving him credit for. Nick and I, we've been all over Brian Thomas Jr. Did not have a great game, but he did drop a touchdown in the end zone where he beat double coverage. Just sucked because if he had that, he has a good fantasy day and looks like a stud. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. Here's my problem with the Jacksonville Jaguars offense. The backfield is confusing as hell. ETN gets hurt very early in the game. Tank Bigsby, who's been the more efficient running back, has been great, has gotten a good amount of snap share. gets 27% in this game. They pivot to Dearness Johnson, who got 56% of the time on the field. It was frustrating as someone that played Tanks Bigsby against Nick in fantasy this week. It was absolutely horrible.
Yes, I'm going to get the win in fantasy.
Yeah.
Did we have the toilet bowl matchup in our league? We might have.
I don't remember.
I'm going to go look at it. You can keep talking, but I'll let the listeners know if we had
rough
the
week for me against Nick. You get Marvin Harrison Jr. with his goose egg and his concussion, and then you get Tank Bigsby, who stopped. Not to be fair, my whole roster sucks this year. One of easily my worst team that I own.
I mean, you played Mike Evans in a week where you didn't want to play Mike Evans.
I didn't have too many pivot options, unfortunately.
Yeah, Waddle on bye and Mostert on bye, so Shakir's out. You've gotten a little bit of you still have Jonathan Brooks, who hasn't returned either, so you do have a bit of a rough stretch here.
Yeah, it sucks. But here's one of the bright spots I want to highlight. Evan Engram came back. 10 catches, 100 yards, very good game. Locked and loaded, stick him in your lineup, no problem. Gabe Davis, he was running cardio for the first 5 games of the year. Currently, he's the wide receiver 5 on the week. Pretty impressive for him. Not sure he's going to sustain that, but in matchups like this and game scripts, it's going to be more favorable for him to catch some more balls. I like that opportunity. And Trevor, it's been fine. He's been matchup-based. That's solid. Next week, they get the New England Patriots. The Patriots have been one of the worst defenses in football, which is weird because Belichick has always had this team as a tough out. No matter who is going up against them, it's weird to say that New England you could take advantage of with your fantasy players. So I do like the upside. If this team does not get rolling against them after they get to stay in London, New England has the long flight. Doug Peterson should be fired, should not be allowed on the plane, should be told to go to a pub with Urban Meyer and go hang out in London because apparently that's what them Jacksonville coaches like to do out there. So I don't think he should be a coach anymore, especially if they lose this game, because that roster, that offense is way too talented to be getting absolutely.
I don't know what happened to that team because they were competing with the Chiefs 2 years ago, and
I mean, even last year,
I don't think Trevor's. I think Trevor's really bad.
Last year, and then he's just never been the same quarterback. It makes no sense.
I think Trevor's really bad. Nick, I have some good news for you. You're not going to be the lowest scorer this week. Looks like you're going to be the second or third lowest scorer, and I don't think we are in the toilet bowl. I think our brothers are actually in the toilet bowl. Their matchup is projected to end 122 to 111 in favor of Joe. I'm going to beat you 135 to 94. So it's going to be close to see who's toilet bowling, but
oh man.
All right. My second take, I'll keep kind of bouncing off your takes. I'm going to go with Drake May here. Drake May is a fantasy upgrade for that Patriots offense. So Drake May scored 21.5 fantasy points. He was the quarterback 9 against a pretty good Texans defense. A lot of people played the Texans defense against Drake May this week. Jacoby Brissett had not finished above the quarterback 26 in any game in the season and had not thrown for over 170 yards. Drake May was 20 for 33, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions, which is -4 fantasy points. I believe he threw for 230 yards. I don't have his yards here. I don't know why I didn't write it down. And 5 rushes for 38 yards. On top of that, Demario Douglas became wide receiver 6 this week. Just on the week, not on the season. He had 21.2 fantasy points. He had 9 targets, 6 receptions, 92 yards, and a touchdown. That's the 3rd game this season that he has had 9 targets. So Nick is correct in stating that he does have a defined role on this team, and it's good to know that the rookie is already targeting him and looking at him as a safety blanket. Now, I'm not going to go and rush and tell you to pick up Drake May because the strength of schedule for the Patriots is super duper tough. They played the Jets once so far this season and got whacked. I think they have the Bills twice this season still. So they are going to have a very tough schedule down the stretch. But if you're in a deeper league, like a 14-person league, I think Drake May is kind of worth owning at this point over guys like Trevor Lawrence or Derek Carr. There are quarterbacks that I believe are droppable, and Drake May is not the 32nd worst quarterback in the league, and he's not in the 32nd worst situation. And I'll make the flip here, and I know we can't do this. I think if Drake May was on the Titans, I think Drake May is a very playable fantasy quarterback in a 12 or 14-man league. And I know that's not saying a lot, but I think Calvin Ridley would be a flex starter on a week-to-week basis. I think Hopkins would be viable. I think Drake May knows how to throw the football where a guy like Will Levis just doesn't. I think Drake May would be better for the Giants. I know the Giants didn't get him. I know I'm just naming hypothetical stupid scenarios, but we play a hypothetical stupid game called fantasy. So we could talk fantasy scenarios in a fantasy game. My point being, I think Drake May is okay, and the Patriots will have to keep building around him, but he showed flashes, and that's all you can really hope for in your first start. Totally. Your second takeaway. Third
Number
takeaway.
3. I'm going to talk about the Buccaneers because someone's got
I wanted to talk about the Buccaneers. And before you jump into it, I think one of us should have had the Bucs in our top 5 offenses, and we didn't. And they are the number 1 offense in fantasy football.
I think the problem was I don't think anyone really expected Godwin to be this elite, and everybody expected Rachaad White to take steps back because he was so inefficient with the fantasy points that he put up, having finished near the top. It didn't make sense. But listen, Baker, QB2 on the year, Godwin, wide receiver 1, Mike Evans, wide receiver 12, no Rachaad White this week. Nick and I have been screaming it. He's not horrible, but he's not that good of a football player. Bucky Irving puts up 18.5 without him. Sean Tucker back at running back, RB1 on the week without White. This is the best the running back room has looked since like 2012 with Doug Martin or something like that. Like this is a loaded team, and their schedule the rest of the season is great. 8 of their 10 opponents for the rest of the year allow top 16 points to the quarterback. 5 of 10 allow top 10 points to the wide receiver position, and 5 of 10 allow top 10 to the running back position. During the fantasy playoffs, they have a very favorable matchups and schedules. I think the Buccaneers offense is going to look great down that stretch. And I, as a fantasy show co-host with Nick, an analyst, I have no MVP vote, but there is no doubt that Baker Mayfield belongs on ballots for the way he's been playing. It is one of the greatest resurgences of a career that I can remember in my football lifetime, and good for him, because not only did he step out of like the Panthers' horrible situation and the Browns' horrible situation, but you look at those two teams, they look horrendous ever since that he left. And then he has to fill the shoes of Tom Brady by stepping over to Tampa Bay. So good for him for being able to resurrect his career. And he is on one of the most QB favorable contracts in football. He's only making like $30 million a year, and he's playing at the level of a guy that should be making 50 to 60.
And people thought he was going to actually take a dip. Lost his offensive coordinator that went to the Panthers. I'm forgetting his name. Panthers head coach. Canales, yeah. And people thought he was going to take a dip this year. I don't think me and Nick were off Baker, but we weren't on Baker. He was just the guy you could draft as a backup. Again, we didn't knock him. It was just, he's a solid backup to own. He's quarterback 2 on the season. And we always say that, when it gets to later on in the season, X% of championship teams had X quarterback. It's going to end up being Baker or Jaden Daniels because of the capital that you have to spend to draft those quarterbacks. Your skill position players are going to be much better because you waited till around 10 or 11 to draft Baker or Jaden Daniels instead of wasting your pick on Patrick Mahomes, who is sitting at quarterback.
It's probably in the 20s with the bye.
Probably, yeah. I can't even find his name on Fantasy Pros. I know he's around here somewhere, but I love taking a chance to dunk on him because I never get why people draft him in fantasy every single year. So
sure.
Okay. Let us go with number 3 for me. The Giants' defensive line / front 7 is legitimate, and people have to start giving them credit. A good friend of mine, Matt Wise, was talking up the Giants D-line before the season. I didn't know how good they were, for being particularly honest with you. After watching them dominate my Seahawks and the Bengals last night, I know how good they are. So let's look at the last 3 weeks and look at them on the season through 6 weeks. They lead the league in sacks with 26. They also lead the league in sack rate. They are number 2 in tackles for loss. They have 2 players with I believe, 5+ sacks already. Brian Burns is just a monster. And I don't even think they had Kayvon Thibodeau last night. So it's another guy that is just waiting in the rafters. They haven't allowed more than 21 points in a game this season. That's pretty solid. Jaden Daniels scored 13.4 fantasy points in week 2. That's his lowest total. He scored over 20 fantasy points in every single week since, and is quarterback 3 on the season. In week 4, Dak Prescott was the quarterback 11, scoring 16.7 fantasy points. Rico Dowdle was running back 22, scoring 13.1 fantasy points. CeeDee Lamb was wide receiver 4, scoring 23.6, solid number. And Jake Ferguson was tight end 7, scoring 11.9. Solid numbers from there. Week 5 against the Seahawks, Geno Smith was quarterback 9. I know it looks great, but he stuffed the stat sheet later on in the game. He scored 22.6 fantasy points. Kenneth Walker, he's been a top 10 back in terms of average, as the running back 15, only scoring 14.6 fantasy points. And I think he needed to get in the end zone to do so, if I remember correctly. The receivers were shut down, and they don't have a good secondary. The receivers are shut down because Geno did not have the time to get the ball out. JSN was the wide receiver 30, 13.1 fantasy points, and DK was wide receiver 50 at 7.5 fantasy points. Same issue with the Bengals last night. Bad offensive line. They got shut down. Joe Burrow in my dynasty league, his bonuses at 15 fantasy points after that first long rushing touchdown. I'm sitting here thinking he's going to have another 40-point game and I could win my matchup. Nope. He ends as the quarterback 12 with 19.8 fantasy points, not throwing a touchdown pass. Chase Brown ended up as the running back 18 with 14.4, but he had that late garbage time touchdown that he should have jumped down for. So I'm chalking that up as an 8-point fantasy performance. I'm not giving him the 14, even though he got it. My point being that was not on the Giants' defensive line. Jamar Chase was wide receiver 27, 12.2 fantasy points, and T. Higgins was wide receiver 24 at the 14.7 fantasy points. So when we do our all bust teams, we actually have to consider the Giants' defense at this point and look at the offensive lines that they're going to be facing because it's going to be a problem. And I'll say this, Nick, whoever gets that Commanders matchup, I don't know when they're facing them, but later on in the season, they will face the Commanders one more time. That is the one week that I am scared to play Jaden Daniels. And I am not scared to play him most weeks. I will be scared to play him. And I don't have him anywhere, so I won't be playing him. I can't. But that Giants defensive line is legitimate. And the Giants really are a quarterback away from competing in that division because they are good in the trenches. And that's how you develop a really good football team.
Yeah, I like it.
Take number 4.
I'm going to talk about the Texans a little bit because I've been dunking on the Texans a little bit too much. And Nico Collins, you don't have him, it's no problem. Stephon Diggs, a guy that I feel like everyone in the fantasy community said there's no way this guy can be great on this offense. Turns out he's the wide receiver 6, and he's got 5 games over 14 points. He's finished in the top 15 receivers 4 times this year. He has been fantastic for fantasy. You can't fault him at this point. And Nico Collins not there. You might say, oh, well, that's a big boost to it. No, it really wasn't. Nico Collins is still a top 5 receiver on the season because of how far up the board he was, and he's going to miss some more time on the IR, which is great. Now you get the return of Joe Mixon. He picked up right where he left off. Week 1, I believe he was the RB1 on the week, maybe RB2. This week, RB2 or 3 on the week, and he scored more points than he did in week 1. That's fantastic. And now I'm going to dunk on them a little bit. I don't like the schedule for this team. They have matchups against some of the best defenses for fantasy football. They have to face the Jets in a couple weeks, Detroit, the Titans, Kansas City, Baltimore. All of these teams are top 6 against the running back position, which is going to struggle for Mixon, who's taking advantage of the good matchups. And then of those teams that I listed, 4 of the 5 of them are top 5 against the wide receiver position. He will face 2 of those in the playoffs, Kansas City and Baltimore. So good luck to Stroud and them boys. I think they're going to be great in the playoffs. I think they're going to make a run, but I don't think the fantasy production is going to be as consistent as it did against the New England Patriots. I would be willing to trade high on Stephon Diggs, get rid of him at this point because he deteriorates. He's an older receiver as the season goes on. Maybe he'll keep it up, but I don't like some of those later matchups for him.
I'm going to talk about Mr. Breakaway Speed, Tony Pollard, who I think should be looked at as the running back sleeper candidate of the year. He running back 18. He was drafted in rounds 7 to 9. Right now he's running back 18, I should say. And I know this doesn't sound great, 18, but he has 15 plus fantasy points in 4 out of 5 games this season. The only stinker that he had was a 5-point performance against the New York Jets, who was one of, if not the best defense in football. And again, Will Levis. If I'm a defensive coordinator, I'm forcing them to run the ball with Tony Pollard because Will Levis. So even with Will Levis, Tony Pollard has 15 plus fantasy points in 4 out of 5 games this season. That's a model of consistency and a great flex play if you get him in your lineup every single week. An average of 15.2, including that stinker game, but without that stinker, he's averaging 17.5. So I want to give some love to Tony Pollard. I think if you drafted him, you got to be pretty happy with his production. I don't think there's many running backs that really are really have been as consistent. I'm looking down the list. It's really just like Kamara and then Derrick Henry. I mean, Saquon just had his stinker this week. Kyron is pretty solid. Chuba Hubbard's actually surprisingly been solid besides his week 1 stinker.
Monty.
Then you look Monty, but DeAndre Swift had a couple stinkers to start the season. But outside of these top 10, there hasn't been a ton of consistency. So I want to give a shout out to a guy that you did draft late that has been consistent. He's been more consistent than James Conner, been more consistent than Aaron Jones, a little bit more consistent than Brian Robinson. So those are the guys that J.K. Dobbins. So those are the guys you're drafting him over or around. So I want to give him his flowers right there.
I want to echo that a little bit. And Tony Pollard, I agree with you, is one of the steals of the draft at this point but I think he's a great trade for candidate. When you talk about players that are
You think people would want to trade him though? That's my only question.
The thing is, I don't think people are realizing how good Tony Pollard has
I don't think
been.
so either, but I maybe it's because I look at all these numbers, but I wouldn't want to trade him if I owned him.
No, I'm saying I would trade for him.
I know what I'm saying. I'm saying I'm not sure who would, at least in competitive leagues.
Yeah, no, I think the consistency has been there, but I think, like you said, it's Will Levis. I feel like you could talk the Tony Pollard owner out of Pollard and say, listen, he's got Will Levis. He's going to fall off a cliff at some point. And when he's a corner red zone game, when he's on the Titans, they're always playing in that 1 o'clock crowded window. They don't put up a ton of points. So you don't see Tony Pollard as much as you see Bijan Robinson, right? Or Breece Hall, who's on PrimeTime in 7 of the first 10 games of the season, right? We don't talk about him because he's not on your TV as much. He's not as entertaining. Same as David Montgomery. David Montgomery's putting on the points with 40% snap share per game this season, right? They're putting up the numbers and no one talks about them because there's other options or they're not really on the field. So I do think Tony Pollard is someone you can acquire a little bit easier than another guy averaging similar numbers who's on a more popular team. Yeah.
All right, Nick, your last takeaway from week 7.
This, to me, has been the most consistent offense in fantasy football. And we talk about them kind of, but we're always like, they're so crowded. I don't really want to play anyone in particular. Well, let me give you some stats. I think the Green Bay Packers have been great with Jordan Love. In the 4 games Jordan Love has played, 29 points, 29 points, 24 points, 34 points. That is one of the best offenses in the league. Jordan Love has 2 finishes in the top 3, 10 touchdowns in his 4 games that he has played. And Jordan Love in the games he has played is averaging 23 points per a game. That is fantastic for fantasy football quarterback. That would rank top 5 in points per game at the position. Then you look at some of the stars around him. Jaden Reed, we've been talking about him. He's ranked in the top 10. He's averaging 22.2 points per game with Jordan Love. Josh Jacobs, running back, has not really had the ceiling that we hoped for, has not really been breaking out. 13.5 points per game with Jordan Love. That is a very solid number at the running back position. Then you go Tucker Kraft, a tight end we really like. His 4 games with Jordan Love, averaging 12.9 points per game. Romeo Doubs, the team leader in snap share per game. He has 12.7 points per game when Jordan Love is the quarterback. And Christian Watson, he got hurt in 1 game earlier in the year. I took that game out and disregarded it. Christian Watson, 13 points per game when he finishes the game with Jordan Love. These are all guys that are super consistent. Nick and I, we mention this stat often in our preseason and our hot takes. There's been one team in recent years that has had 3 receivers finish in the top 30 of fantasy football. It was the Pittsburgh Steelers. None of them were super explosive. It was Chase Claypool, Juju Smith-Schuster, and Deontay Johnson. None of them finished up above the wide receiver 17. Not all of them finished in the top 30 receivers. I think we are going to see this offense be very similar to that, where all these guys are putting up consistent numbers. They are safe floor plays. They are great flex options on your bye weeks outside of Jaden Reed and Josh Jacobs, who should be locked in every week. But I think that there's a lot more opportunity than we give him credit for. I'm not going to be scared to play the Packers receivers on my team, just because these guys have been so consistent with the little games that Jordan Love has been able to play.
This is going to be our argument for the season because I wanted to beat the drum that the Packers offense is inconsistent, which is my point last week. Jordan Love is consistent, but I'm not looking at consistency on any of these guys. Josh Jacobs at running back 20, that's a bust. You drafted him in your top 3 rounds. He's sitting right next to Breece, and Breece hasn't played tonight, so I can't even mention him. But Jacobs, who has suited up in all 6 games this season and not had an injury, that's a bust for a guy that you drafted within your top 20, 25 picks. You drafted him over a lot of talented players. Yeah. So Jacobs has suffered significantly with Jordan Love on the field. Jaden Reed has been the biggest beneficiary, I think. But aside from that, even Tucker Kraft, we were all over that. And then Tucker Kraft throws up a stinker this week because other receivers got the ball. Romeo Doubs has only had, I just had him pulled up, and I'm pretty sure he only has 1 game over 10 fantasy points this season. Yes, I'm correct on that. And it was this week. So even though he's on the field a lot, again, that there is no consistency on that offense besides Jordan Love. And I guess Jaden Reed, I could give him his flowers. I think Nick's correct in the sense where this might end up being a situation where 2 or 3 receivers notch in the top 25, but none of them notch in the top 15. But I'm still hesitant to say play the Green Bay Packers players because there's no singular consistency with any of those players besides Jordan Love. And you're not going to know who's going to go off every single week. I wanted to talk about the Texans offense, but Nick got that point. My overall point about the Texans offense is that offense can only support 2 wide receivers. I said to play Tank Dell on my all boom team this week. I think he had 5 receptions, 60 yards, and a touchdown, so close to 20 fantasy points. Tank's going to be a great play for the next 3 or 4 weeks. But once Nico Collins comes back, he's got to hit your bench because they can only support 2 wide receivers because they are star wide receivers. Green Bay doesn't really have a singular star. It's kind of a situation like Buffalo where I don't know who I can trust to play where Shakir was a solid flex play and Kincaid is teetering on that. It's kind of the same as the Packers. So I'm going to keep pounding that point home, even if Nick disagrees with me. We can continue that throughout the season. But until I see consistency from anybody who's catching passes or rushing the ball, I can't give them the flowers of calling them a top 5 offense when I'm scared to play their players. So that I will rest my case on that for the moment. All right, my final point, and this is not a point I originally had, again, because Nick had 3 points that I wanted to take. So my other 4 points were my points, but this 5th one is one I had to sub in. Let's talk about the $120 million man. Shout out to my brother, Joe. $120 million man, 4 years, $76 million guaranteed, tied for the 5th highest receiver in the NFL. He's got to be the leading wide receiver on his team. He's got to be the leading touchdown scorer on his team. Listen, Nick, the 49ers have the 2nd highest yards per game and the 6th highest points per game. He's got to be up there, right? Like, he's got to be a fantasy football stud for a guy that hasn't gotten injured and spends a lot of time on the field. No, wide receiver 43, a guy I told you to bust before the season. He is a big bust. Let's look at some of the names that he is sitting around at wide receiver 43 at the moment. Let's go 40 to 50. These are guys who are ahead of him. Darius Slayton, Christian Kirk, George Pickens. These are guys that are behind him. Xavier Worthy, Rashad Bateman, Olave, another bust. Mario Douglas, Michael Wilson, Khalil Shakir, and Lade McConkey. Even his average on the field is not even over 10. His average is only 9.7 fantasy points.
I think he only has 1 game over double digits too.
He has every game is under 10 except for 1 game at 22.7. It was in the week that Nick put him on the all boom team. He faced Seattle.
Maybe I just got to all boom him every week.
Maybe was it Seattle? Who was the team he was facing that you said he just cooks? It's not Seattle. It was the Vikings, not the Vikings. Arizona. So Nick noted the great stats that Ayuk has against Arizona, but the other 5 games under 10 fantasy points. His other counterparts on the field, Deebo Samuel sitting at wide receiver 25. He's missed a couple games. I want to pull up Deebo's average. That's on me for not having Deebo's average. Deebo's average is 14.1, which would only put him a little bit higher. Actually, let me get that number for you since I'm on Fantasy Pros. So Deebo's average is 14.1, puts him at wide receiver 24, which really isn't that much better. He has 3 out of 5 games over 15 with 2 stinkers. And there's George Kittle, tight end 1 on the year. He has 4 out of 5 games over 14 fantasy points. He's been great. Jordan Mason's been the running back 7, 3 out of 5 games over 17 fantasy points. They are run first team. And then Ayuk seems like the odd man out for skipping training camp, for skipping every practice. And I know it takes a couple weeks for guys to get worked into the system, but Jamar Chase right now is sitting at wide receiver 2. And he missed all of training camp. Stephon Diggs went to a new location and he's wide receiver 6. CeeDee Lamb missed a good chunk of camp, I think, right? You know, complaining about the contract, and he's wide receiver 8. So there is no excuse for Brandon Ayuk not being more involved in the offense. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's a punishment from Kyle Shanahan. I don't know if he just isn't running good routes. I don't know if he doesn't have the chemistry. I don't have advanced stats for you. All I could tell you is a fantasy football play. If I took this name out and I read these stats out to Nick would tell you he's borderline droppable. And I probably would too. So is he? And this is the second year in the past 3 years where Ayuk started really, really slow and was on the drop radar. When me and Nick were giving you guys 5 shows a week, we had a segment called Stash or Trash. Brandon Ayuk was on that segment for like 4 weeks in a row. And I think we told you to stash him most of the time, but I digress. He has been one of the bigger busts, and I don't think people are talking about how much of a bust he has been. And that has to change, or your team is probably in trouble because of the draft capital that you did spend a top 4-round pick on a guy who's just really not producing it off of your flex spot.
No, I mean, that's definitely true. He has struggled. There's been no excuse for him. The only thing I will say is defenses have been guarding him a lot better. The 49ers, they've really been saying, Brock Purdy, go take all the underneath stuff. You're not going to beat us over the top, and that's why they have not been winning a ton of games. And Ayuk's schedule does not get any easier. He's going to go see Kansas City next week off of a bye. That's horrible. Dallas, as much as Dallas' defense has been vulnerable, they are one of the better teams against the position, against the wide receiver position. Then they get the bye. Then they have tough matchups on the back half of the schedule for the week before the playoffs, the 2 weeks before the playoffs, and then the playoffs. They're going to go at Buffalo, Chicago, Rams, Miami. All 4 of those teams rank inside the top 16. 3 of the 4 of them rank inside of the top 5 against the wide receiver position. And then championship week is the Detroit Lions, and that should be a fun shootout for us.
Yeah.
But totally it's going to be hard to get there if you have Ayuk.
Yeah, correct. Correct. So something has to change. And if McCaffrey does return, I know Ayuk was, successful with McCaffrey on the field last year, but I can't imagine if McCaffrey returns, let's say by week 10, I think it only cuts into Ayuk's, target share. Same with Debo. So I can't imagine that McCaffrey returning would help Ayuk, but maybe I'm wrong on that.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right, guys, that is our first show for week 7. Make sure you set those waiver wires by 3:00 a.m. Wednesday morning. Hopefully you enjoyed the show. If you're a first-time listener and you're watching on YouTube, make sure to drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell icon so you get notifications every time we go live on a Sunday or when we drop a new video during the week. If you're listening on an audio streaming platform, please give us a 5-star rating and a review. We are on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcast, and Anchor. We'd appreciate all that support. We're available on all social media platforms as well. Twitter is PrimeTime FF Pod. Instagram is PrimeTime Fantasy Football Podcast. Those are the 2 ways to reach us during the week if, to answer your questions if you're not getting them in on the Sunday morning live show. Thank you guys again for the support and for listening to us. We'll talk to you guys on Friday.